We are learning today, our topic today is welfare state or character development. This is a second part of the series called On the Giving End. I want to just start off by thanking Ed and Sandy Clark, who are sponsoring this entire series, as we now approach very fast the first yahrzeit, or just past this last Friday, the first yahrzeit of Mr. David Clark, David Tzvi ben Yosef Yehuda, whose memory goes beyond the yahrzeit. And in many ways, Be'ezras Hashem, Nishmasai Eden. We also want to thank this morning Autumn and Bruce Mail, who are sponsoring today's shir, as we note the yahrzeit of Autumn's father, Mr. Walter Lido Zev ben Moshe, whose smile was just a aperture into the happiest being, person who has just lived a joyful life. And we want to also thank the Cunans who are sponsoring for the yahrzeit Boba Yom today of Mr. Morris Siegel, Moshe Dov ben Yitzchak Yosef, that is Lorraine's father, whose yahrzeit is today Nishmasai Eden. He should have a Lechtige Gan Eden. We are also thanking Shalom and Lori Huberfeld, who are sponsoring for the yahrzeit of Shalom's father, Pinchas Huberfeld, Pinchas ben Moshe Aaron, upon his upcoming yahrzeit this week. God willing, he should have a continued Aliyas Neshama. And from afar, we thank Yitzhak and Barbara Lehman Siegel, who are sponsoring for the yahrzeit of Barbara's mother's yahrzeit, Sarah Ann Lehman, Sarah Bas Yitzhak Meshulam Faish, and Chaya Chana Edel. Be'ezras Hashem, she should have a continued Aliyas Neshama. Thank you for being part of this of our learning today. What is the topic today? Today is one of the most difficult topics in general, and that is that how do you make the decision, or where along the spectrum does a government get involved with the runnings of society? And this is something which we've struggled with for ages. Every society struggles with how much free market, how much regulation do you have, and every government has a different way, and every country has a different way of figuring it out, tightening the bolts on this particular issue. Is it more regulated? Is it more socialist, more capitalist? Is it less regulated? Is it unfettered capitalism? When does the government need to re-regulate things? This is something which affects us on a daily basis. Much of the political debates we have about governments is about this free trade, and one of the type places this affects is the element of society which deals with the idea of poverty and welfare nets. How much is the government expected to do that? What responsibility does it bear? What responsibility do we bear towards those who are less fortunate than us in society? And this has been a long debate. We'd like to take a walk down a fascinating historical avenue as it relates to this. But before doing so, just a quick question about how it relates to the notion of Jewish society. Now, Jewish society, we'll call diaspora society certainly, and even in Israel society, is there a role of organized community and government? And the answer is absolutely. Today, in the diaspora, we have to think about it in terms of organizations and community. In Israel, we have to think about it in terms of government. We haven't dealt with government for the most part of 2,000 years. Only in the last 75 do we actually have that as an instrument. So a lot of diaspora thinking is still antiquated discussions of community, which is fine. But just to appreciate that it can be ratcheted up to a much larger perspective. Just as an example, the greatest supporter of Torah in the world today is, which entity is that? The Israeli government. Right? Because the Israeli government is far more powerful than any organization, any donor, or any foundation in terms of the amount that's being given to support in Nicola, despite what other people would say about it. But let's just appreciate that. So the government is an extremely powerful organ because it is essentially it is the siphon through which taxes are channeled and budgets are set. So very, very powerful. But we're going to think about it in terms of the smaller spaces which exist. We'll call communal spaces. Let's start together. So the Rambam talks about this. Remember, the Rambam talks about all aspects of halacha, and this also happens to be in Shulchan Aruch as well. But the Rambam is setting the framework for us. Is there a responsibility? And he says yes, on a city by city basis. Again, dealing with a more, we'll call it, smaller area of governance. there is a requirement. And we're just going to learn through some of the halachas together, and then we're going to see an interesting application of this in halacha. So the first source is the Rambam in Hilchos Matnas Aniyim. In the 9th parak, he says, Kol ir sheyesh bo Yisrael, any city which has a Jewish presence, which is pretty much a lot of cities around the world, Chayavim lahamid la'meihem gabayit tzedakah anoshim yaduim v'ne'emanim shiyu machzirin al ha'am me'erev Shabbos le'erev Shabbos v'loichin mikol echad ve'echad mashehu roi liteim. So there is a responsibility to set up a system by which the poor are taken care of, and the responsibility is to collect and to distribute. And who are the people who are chosen? People who have a history, are ne'emanim, are people who are faithful people. V'hein machalkin ma'amos me'erev Shabbos to erev Shabbos, and it's an erev Shabbos distribution set up by the city as well. And then he goes on to describe the next paragraph, another idea of a daily, what's called a distribution, which is tamchui, those who can't make it from meal to meal or day to day, that's set up by the city. Notice, by the way, who is setting up such a system? Who's setting up such a system? What's the responsibility on? The community. So therefore, who would be the representative of the city, just to appreciate this? Probably communal leaders, rabbis, would get together, have a council and say, our city needs X. Notice that that's a little different than where we are today. Notice that most of the organizations, and just to appreciate where we stand today in America, most of the organizations are set up by, magnanimous individuals who want to fill a gap, generally speaking, and then they're because it's done in such a way, it isn't a community organization, although it will turn to the community as a communal organization, but there'll be multiple organizations doing similar things, right? And there'll be overlap between them because it wasn't set up by the community, it was set up by wonderful people. But in the end of the day, right? So if it had been the way the Rambam describes it, the community would get together, say, what do we need? We'll have one organization for all food distribution, one organization for all clothing distribution, and then the community will take responsibility, and with responsibility comes the fact that its budget is not based on fundraisers and dinners, but based on collection, right? So just to understand the difference between, I would say, even the tzedakah collection in our societies are more capitalistic than what the Rambam is describing, just to appreciate this, okay? So what was that? Similarly, again, it started off with an individual, which is wonderful, and the community bears a responsibility towards it, but it wasn't the community saying, oh, this is what we need. It was a few individuals who got together and then, and reversed into the community, which is great. And that's how it should be, because there was an absence of it. But it really, it should be a priori the community saying, what is it that we need to do? How do we set this up? Who's going to be in charge of it? And therefore, how do we support it? Meaning, every household puts a line item on their monthly, weekly budget that goes towards us, because this is not a game. This is a basic responsibility. Yes, go on.
Also, my cousin started it.
What was that? Mitzvah, yeah, the mitzvah is a wonderful thing. It's set up in the void, and most communities, thank God, we have a Chevra Kadisha. And so, and shuls and communities should have Chevra Kadishas. They are set up in the absence in what we'll call the Shtibel world, where there's no such organization. But again, it's set up by wonderful people, but it wasn't a community organization, just to appreciate this. The Rambam is saying is the community needs to get together and set up these organizations. So there seems to be some requirement of regulation. More than that, let's say, what about oversight? So in source 2, the Rambam says, Hakupa and on Nigbeis Ela Bishnayim. You cannot have one sole individual who has full power over the kuppah, over the charity distribution. Why? Because power corrupts. It's not good to have one person by themselves. It's not good to have themselves. You can't have somebody financially responsible of the community with sole proprietorship. There has to be oversight. There has to be somebody else who's looking at the books, who's in the office. Right? And it can only be distributed among 3. Meaning there needs to be a committee. It can't be that all the power or the bottleneck is through one person as well. So it's set up in such a way that there is oversight as well internally. Says the Rambam. Let's talk about source 3, suspicion. So the Rambam says, so let's say that the person who is the responsible party of the community also has his own debts that he gives out. He gives loans to people. And let's say this person who owes him money for a personal debt happens to encounter them on Central Avenue. And now he wants to repay the debt. So what's the problem? So now the problem is we're going to be mixing personal and communal funds, right? And that's not so good, right? That's not so good because all you need now is somebody to say, aha, you see what's going to happen. What will the picture on the front page of the local rag look like? Right? It's going to be, Garbage stock are taking money from an individual and placing where? In the top pocket of their suit, right? That's not a good picture to have on the front page of things because naturally nobody will ask what actually happened, right? The story will have to be explained afterwards. So says the Rambam, Lo yitneim l'Torah kisai, he cannot put any monies this person receives personally into their wallet. Ela l'Torah arna kishel tzedakah. He has to put any monies into the distribution bag that he's carrying. And then he'll take it out. Because there has to be a person who lives in this space has to be above suspicion. You can't mix personal and public funds in terms of the public eye. One has to be very careful about these things as well. And by the way, even this goes even further back. If you go to the Mishnah, it talks about the garbage stock of the Beis Hamikdash, and it talks about they used to have to speak all the time because of the concern that maybe they'll be hiding money in their mouths, right? So you have to be like there's certain levels of transparency. By the way, things are not new. These are all the levels, and the obviously halacha values the importance of transparency over here. Coercion. This is the interesting piece. This piece also does not exist in our community as much, which is Misha Eino Rotzelitain Staka Oishiyitain Ma'at Mimashiroiloi. They do a house to house, right? Because the community has to float these organizations. This is not private organizations that need dinners or breakfast. This is what the community has to do. So let's say, number 24 on XYZ lane is it doesn't give the distributions. They don't believe. They don't have people who need, and therefore they don't contribute towards that. So then, based in Koifin Oisai Umakin Oisai Makas Maridosai Shiyitain Mashiya Amadu Litain, being as the charity is a representation of the community. Therefore, the community's arm, which is a judicial arm, which is going to be there, the based in, is going to have to take forceful acts against number 24 in XYZ lane to ensure that they're contributing to the community. Because how could you live in a community without contributing? Which leads to the next question, which is: so how long do you have to be living in the community for that to be your responsibility? So the Rambam says that residency is dependent on a few things. In source 5, Mishi Yashav b'Medina shloshim yom koifin oisai litain staka lakupa im b'nei HaMedina. Once you reach 30 days in the community, you now have entered the residency requirements for that area, and you have to contribute towards that. Before then, you're a visitor. It's nice. You're on freeloader. But once you're there for 30 days, you're in. Yasha sham shlosha chadashim. 3 months in, right? You get your lease reaches 3 months. Then you're there for the daily distribution. That's the soup kitchen. Yasha sham shisha chadashim, 6 months residency. Then you get into the clothing distribution responsibility, right? So you can imagine the letter under the door is going to the envelope is now going to include more requirements for your contributions. Yasha sham tisha chadashim, 9 months. Then you have to go to the Hebrew Free Burial Society's responsibility, and you're part of that. Notice over here that none of this is about individual magnanimous, feeling good about things, and this is about how Jewish communities need to run. And in order for it to run, there's certain facilities which need to exist, including Chevra Kadisha, food distribution, clothing distribution, and everybody's responsible, and everybody therefore is forced to be responsible to this. So it sounds like it's a very regulated society. In a certain degree, and we've lost that to a certain degree because generally communal governance and force and coercion is not something which is a value necessarily in the society that we live. And being as that's a fact, that's not the way it works. You should know. In the Catholic societies, to a certain degree, it still does exist in certain ways. So as an example, let's say the Catholic school is not dependent on those paying tuition, it's dependent on the community, as an example. So the community itself pays for the school because it is a value to have a school. So as opposed to school coming cap in hand to have to beg from the people who are the parents, which is a small, I would call, subset of the community, the entire community supports institutions, as an example. So there's something that's worthwhile thinking about in terms of the way that Jewish communal structure is today, certainly in America, where it's all seen as starting at zero, and my contribution is seen as a nice thing. in the way that it's seen in the way of the Rambam's world is it's not a nice thing, it's a necessary thing, because these are things that you need to exist in a community. And we're very blessed to be in a society which creates these organizations, but the attitude we have towards them is it's nice and it's good, but it's not good, it's necessary. So there should be more partnership or ownership of the community itself. That beer is made. Now, this takes us down a fascinating discussion that actually, or a historical event that occurred around this, and it goes back to the 1980s, and at this point in England, where there was a severe change in terms of the policy of how the government related to the individual. And so moving into the Thatcher era, Margaret Thatcher, who the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Also, just to be noted in terms of the alliance with the Reagan administration, the Thatcher-Reagan administration across the Atlantic, with similar conservative views of the way that the society should run. Margaret Thatcher was a believer, and we're out espousing one side over the other. But just to just quick summary of how this works. So one of the things that she did was she denationalized many of the major organizations. So like the mines, she denationalized. She broke the unions. She was able to move it back to a more capitalistic society. Why? Because at that time the GDP, the economy of England was in a terrible place. England was in debt, and her moral is that people do not wash rented cars. Right? If you're getting something which is not yours, you don't take care of it. You don't care. You don't look after it so much. And against much friction, because this ended up hurting a lot of people. Certainly at the beginning, many people were affected by this. She slowly moved it back to a capitalistic society where people had to earn for themselves, take pride in their own work, and ultimately a change. So just like in terms of appreciation of the numbers, take a look at page 3 to page 4. This is a chart of the GDP, and over the period of it's from 1989 to 79 to 89. So the 10 years in which she was in power, and you can see the growth over here in total government. These are points: law and order, employment and training, health and social security. I think just in terms of employment and training, so 33% increase in GDP. That's a very significant increase, and this was as a function of much of her policies. And by the way, many people suffered. Many people lost jobs because they were subsisting on government organizations and welfare as she did this. And there was a lot of friction that she faced. It's worthwhile noting that she was such a powerful person. She was called the Iron Lady. She was so powerful that she, at a certain point, she reached such a epoch of power that they used to joke. The joke was that when she would walk into a restaurant with a number of her ministers, they would say to her, "Would you like steak or vegetables?" And she said, "I'll take steak." And she says, "And vegetables?" And she says, "They'll take steak too." She ruled England with an iron fist, and she changed a lot of things. However, it's interesting that although she managed to overcome much resistance in Parliament itself for many years, it was fascinating that the one area in which she faced resistance actually became the church, and the Archbishop of Canterbury ultimately did a 2-year research in which he published a pamphlet, an extremely long pamphlet based on his research called Faith in the City. And in it, Faith in the City. You can see the report is found on page 5, on the top of page 5. That's the cover page of it. A call for action by church and nation. A report of the Archbishop of Canterbury's Commission in Urban Priority Areas. UPAs, what they called. We'll call this inner city slums. That's what there would be projects, right? That's the British word for it was these UPAs. And the tagline, as I just quoted over here, is to examine the strengths, insights, problems, and needs of the church's life and mission in urban priority areas, and as a result to reflect on the challenge which God may be making to church and nation, and to make recommendations to appropriate bodies. And this was not a small report by any standards. It's I think it was 440 pages. It's a very significant report based on research done in the inner cities and those who are living there. And it was essentially a criticism on government, based on a number of ideas, based on policy, based on statistics, and then also based on the Hebrew and Christian Bibles, saying that what the Thatcher administration was doing was against the basic precepts of the Hebrew, or the Old and the New Testaments. And that was the criticism, which is a hard thing to hear, that the government itself is being attacked by religion with some significant recommendations. This was published in 1985, and it was the beginning of 1986 that the chief rabbi of England then, a man by the name of Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz, who actually was a very fascinating individual. He actually served here in the Fifth Avenue Synagogue for 8 years in the 50s to 60s. Returned, he was the chief rabbi of Dublin and Ireland, and ultimately became the chief rabbi of England, was knighted. He, in the beginning of 1986, wrote a long article called From Doom to Hope. I actually managed to find it. It was quite hard to find in the Jewish Chronicle, and to get the original, I found the original. It was a double-page issue. It was a double-page spread, a very long essay. And in this essay, the chief rabbi essentially defends the prime minister against the attack of the church on her policies. Fascinating moment in history. Margaret Thatcher ultimately said, "I appreciate the rabbi of the church," which was, if you think about that, that's a pretty remarkable thing to hear certainly in the United Kingdom after centuries of anti-Semitism. You know that the Jews were kicked out of England for 350 years, right? So until Oliver Cromwell, there were no Jews in England since the 1200s. It's a long and dark history in England. But nonetheless, he wrote this article, which, although is extensive, is certainly much shorter than the article Faith in the City, or the paper The Faith in the City. I'd like to concentrate on a few salient points that he makes. The first thing he says is he points to the fact that perhaps those who are living in these projects, in what are they called, these urban priority areas, have a lot to learn from the Jews. Because guess what? If you reverse 100 years, where were all the Jews living? They were called in those days not urban priority areas. That's a very nice euphemistic way of calling a ghetto, right? Which means to say an area which is not part of the main commerce in society, where there is dilapidated housing, with overpopulation and not enough amenities. That's precisely what a ghetto was. And guess what? Guess where Jews were living, or forced to live for centuries, with economic ceilings and with the inability to be able to escape them. Guess what? That's where the Jews were living. And he pointed out that perhaps there are some lessons which are worthwhile learning from the Jews, because he pointed out that the Jews are no longer living in these UPAs. They were no longer living in the ghettos. Somehow they had left. And how did they leave? He pointed out that it was not because they demanded government handouts. It was not because they demanded that they needed to have extra supplements or bursaries to colleges. It was because they focused on the only things they had within their control, and that is education, and aspiring that the next generation do better. That the parents who came from a foreign country, who didn't speak the language, who didn't have as many opportunities, worked the skin off their backs in order their children should be able to get high school degrees and maybe even college degrees, so their children could be professionals and enter society. And guess what? It worked. But he pointed out that it is irrational to assume that suddenly that arriving immigrant is going to, within 2 months, suddenly become mainstreamed into society, because they demand that society owes it to them. That's not the way it worked for the Jews, and it's not the way it works for anyone. And so he points out that there's a lot to be learned from this, and he actually quotes a sermon he gave in New York City when he was the rabbi over here about this particular issue, because he was talking in the 60s, of course, when there was a lot of the same kind of friction happening in the inner cities here in the main cities in America as well. Really worthwhile thinking about this. This is not the message that one wants to hear. In fact, this is in 1986. He describes a particular meeting he was at where there was a Jamaican a Jamaican religious leader at a meeting who was describing that the police, talking about police brutality or police racism against his subset of the population, not something necessarily new today. And he pointed out that one of the things, and it's true, that there is a difference between perhaps the Jewish conditions and perhaps some of the other ethnic minorities who lived in these ghettos societies, and it's not about race or skin color, but it was about culturally Jewish. And he says, but in the end of the day, he says the first thing that the Jews did was to embrace the system of government and law, not to fight it and demand that it was unfair to them. And it took a long time to amalgamate into society, but their contention was trying to be more British, not trying to change British society, but rather trying to meet society, as opposed to trying to tell society was wrong and everything needed to change around them. So there's a lot that can be worthwhile thinking about 30 plus years later. There's a lot that still is relevant in this particular issue. But this is not relating to the report so much as he's saying we have the shared experience of having lived through this. Maybe there's what that can be learned through the Jewish angle as well. But going into the actual theology of it, he quotes a number of things. So the first thing he says, and this is an important piece. Let's take a look at on page 6, in the middle of the page. He does give a lot of credence to the report, and he says, before examining the findings of the report in any detail, it should be stated emphatically and without equivocation that Judaism is in complete agreement with the basic assumption underlying the report that religious leaders and organizations should address themselves to the grave social problems afflicting society today, both by arousing public conscience on widespread suffering and injustice, granting a high place among our theological priorities, and if necessary, even by questioning the morality of economic policies in the light of their effects. So you're saying, yes, the Archbishop of Canterbury is correct. The religious leaders do need to be at the table when making government policies, because it's going to affect society, and guess whose boots are on the ground is those who live in those societies and perhaps have a perspective historically, theologically on this. So he agrees with the principle in general that such a report should be issued. However, he then at that point in time he diverges and says that there are many things that are said in the report which are incorrect as well. So let us take a look at some of them. In source 6, this is on page 6, he quotes Faith in the City. This is 9, when it says 9.52, that means chapter 9, article 52. He says, but we must question whether, this is the Archbishop of Canterbury, at a time when our economy is in transition to an uncertain future, dogmatic and inflexible macroeconomic stance is appropriate. We believe that it is a more open debate is needed for this about this type of society. We believe that a more open debate is needed about the type of society present economic policies are shaping. We recommend that the Church and its bishops should play a full part in such a debate, for Christian gospel sets values in relation to dignity and the worth of each individual, and in relation to human society against which economic dogma must be judged. So he's saying that ultimately you can't make unilateral decisions about society, then it needs to be more of a democratic position. It's the government's fault for ignoring the rights of specific individuals by doing certain unilateral actions which will affect many impoverished people and taking away their safety nets or their paychecks from the government. Responds Rabbi Jacobowitz in source 7. He says, well, yes. He says, but the selfishness of workers in attempting to secure better conditions at the cost of the rising unemployment and immense public misery can be just as morally indefensible as the rapaciousness of the wealthy in exploiting the working class in order to add even more digits to their astronomical profits, or as unacceptable as a government biased in favor of equating success with virtue rather than need with opportunity and human dignity with supreme merit. So he's saying that in the end of the day, yes, there are many ills in society, but think about this for a moment. You have the people at the very, very top, the 1%ers, and they're using those perhaps as their base to be able to advance their cause without any recourse from the lower echelons of society. But there are also those who are using the system itself at the cost of other people who can't use the system because of the systems of welfare that were created as well. That's equally as problematic when you create systems which can be manipulated and are manipulated by the many at the bottom as well. That's one observation he makes. Let's go a little further. What about the attitude to wealth? So the argues the Archbishop of Canterbury in Source 8, the tradition of Christian social thought, he says, it is against the background of the excessive individualism of much Christian thinking in the 19th century that we must place Marx's perception of that evil is to be found not just in the human heart, but in the very structures of economic and social relationships. You know where he's going now, right? You can see where the Archbishop is going. In other words, society, capitalistic society, has problems in and of itself. Therefore, we need a little more Marxism, right? We need a little bit of regulation to take away the imbalances of wealth. This perception is also found to a notable degree in the Old Testament. That's our book of the Torah, from which, in fact, Marx may have derived it. Wow, that's a big statement. Okay, so, right, and of course, Karl Marx, with his fabulous beard, was Jewish. Although I doubt that this was where he started necessarily. It could be that he maybe hung his hat on it. But where there is explicit recognition of the inevitable tendency of the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer, unless some constraint is imposed to limit the freedom of the individuals to profit without restraint from a market economy. Right, so you're saying that wealth in and of itself is seen as a bad thing in terms of the Bible, the Old Testament. You need to have some sort of way to regulate it, that you distribute more evenly, because otherwise the division is just going to continue. Which, by the way, is a pretty accurate assessment. It's very hard to break that. And then he goes. Good question. Yes. Good question. So he's arguing that by the Torah's commandment to give charity, essentially it's trying to regulate away wealth from the wealthy. And you're pointing out that it doesn't help, right? Which is a good point. That's true. But it's more than that. It's more than that. Take a look a little further. Look at the gap, and then the next paragraph he says the creation of wealth must always go hand in hand with distribution. The product must have some intrinsic value, and its production must have due regard to social, ecological consequences. It's a long Christian tradition, reaching back to the Old Testament prophets, and supported by influential schools of economic and political thought, which firmly rejects the amassing of wealth unless it is justly obtained and fairly distributed. Meaning, wealth by itself is bad unless you're distributing it as well. That's his argument. Says Rabbi Jacobowitz, is wealth inherently bad in Judaism? Not necessarily so. Just yesterday in Meshabas Mevorachim, what was the one thing we asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Oisha v'kavod, right? So that's in liturgy, that's in part of the prayers, is we ask for Oisha v'kavod. If wealth is seen as such a bad thing, right, that needs to be, so to speak, tightened and regulated and distributed, then how are we asking for it? More than that, in fact, he points to a few sources. Let's take a look at the top of page 8. When Moshe Rabbeinu receives the recommendation of his father-in-law Yisro to appoint judges, he is told, so these are the conditions for judges in Jewish community. Fascinating list of things. Anshe Chayil, these are vigorous men, Yirei Elokim, who fear God, Anshe Emes, men of truth, and they hate bribery. What does it mean? Anshe Chayil says the Rashi, Anshe Chayil, quoting the Gemara, She'ein Ashirim. A judge needs to be rich, because then they have no reliance on anybody who's going to be accosting them in the street about their decision making. In other words, riches is seen as a prerequisite to certain elements of communal leadership, because it makes you less impervious, less weak to these things. The Gemara, they're susceptible. The Gemara in Ksubas talks about in terms of distribution, there's also a cap on distribution as well. Meaning, how much is an individual expected to give? When we talk about, by the way, today it's more complex, just because people are vested in multiple investments. But when most things were liquid, a person can't give more than a fifth, 20% of their assets. In other words, that's the max. That's the max cap of where it fits in terms of giving tzedakah. And Rashi says, why? Because if a person gives too much, they themselves will become needy. Now, there needs to be an element of ownership and distribution, but it's not because I don't own the money. I own the money, and I'm allowed to ask for that money, and I'm allowed to succeed, but I need to give as well. The Gemara in Shabbos, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi, Ashirim Sheberetz Yisrael, B'mehein Zochen. How do the rich people in Israel, why are they so successful? He says, Amalai B'shvil Shema Ashirim Shema Asrin, because they give maaser. Shneimar aser ta'aser aser b'shvil shetis asher. The Gemara darshans that you're allowed to give in order to get rich. Meaning, to say if you give tzedakah, you know Hashem is guaranteed that there's going to be a payback from that. How did they get rich? They did it because they gave tzedakah as well. So yes, tzedakah is a requirement, but is wealth considered something which is terrible? No, necessarily. Attitude to work. The Archbishop of Canterbury goes on in source 16. And he points out, so starting on line 3, social position follows types of employment or profession. Long working hours are rewarded by extra pay or promotion. Personal respect is gained by the ability to hold down a job. One of the first questions you asked of a stranger is, what do you do? There is none of this in the Bible or early Christian tradition. Certainly there is a condemnation of idleness. None may unilaterally contract out of work which is necessary for society to sustain itself, but beyond this, work is never seen as a means of gaining wealth or status. It's not, in other words, work is not seen as an ideal or who you are. Why is society so focused on what you do as opposed to who you are? Now there's a lot to be said about that, but says Rav Jacob, I beg your pardon, but if you read Sefer Yonah, what was the question the sailors asked Yonah on the boat there? They say, the first thing the sailors ask him is, what do you do? What precisely do you do? Meaning, he says, you'll never find this in the Bible. You actually do find this in the Bible, interestingly enough. As well, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes Adam HaRishon, the first thing he does, what? To work it and to guard it. In other words, work is seen not as this negative, bidi eved, terrible situation that shouldn't be defining us. It was the first thing human beings were told to do. The Gemara by Basra says, quoting in source 19, says in the sugyas of later on by Menashe ben Moshe, Gershom ben Menashe ben Moshe. It's better to do avodah zara than to need other people. The Gemara says, whoa. The grandson of Moshe, whose name was Yonatan ben Gershom ben Moshe, thought that meant to say that even it's better to be involved in avodah zara rather than to be on the dole, to be dependent on society. And that was an incorrect reading of the statement. That's why he worked in a place called Pesach Micha. He was the priest of this shrine in the times of Shoftim. Not a good thing. So the Gemara says, that does not what the Gemara meant. That's not what the tradition means. Ela avodah zara, avodah shezara loy. Could amalei Rav Kahana natoish nevelasa b'shuka v'shakol igrava loy tema gavra rabba ana v'zila bei milsa. Zila bi milsa. The Gemara says, it is important even to skin a carcass in the marketplace, which is obviously a very degrading and very lowly and very humiliating job. It's not very pleasant. Do that to earn your salary rather than to require charity. Avodah shi zara loy. Do a work which is strange to you rather than require charity. In other words, what is the space of work, the attitude to work? Well, the Torah seems to say take pride in your work. That's part of who you're supposed to be. The Shir HaMalos Kuf Chav Ches is Ashrei Kol Yirei Hashem Ha'olech B'Drachav Yagia Kapecha Kisachel Ashrecha V'Tovlach. The work of your hands you should eat. You should work hard and earn hard. You shouldn't be sitting there getting handouts, feeling good because society is supporting you. You should do everything within your means to work hard and take pride in it. The Medrash in Kala Rabasi, Asya Kedisnan Rabbi Shimon Omer Hamadir es Ishto Mela Asas Melachta Yotzi V'Yitin Ksuba Sha Batala Mi'aval Lidei Shiamum. Person who makes a neder or restriction on one's spouse not to work, that's going to end in an ended marriage because batala, unemployment or uninvolvement, idleness is going to lead to all kinds of terrible things. Idleness is not a good thing. Employment is way better than idleness. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is focusing on the fact that work is overemphasized. And why is society looking at work so much as an ideal that we should de-emphasize the importance of work? And Rabbi Jacob is saying, well, the Torah seems to think of that as pretty significant. And I think perhaps the most important of the arguments or the divergences is entitlement versus responsibility. This is a very important paragraph in source 22. This is where the Archbishop and his team point to the following. The high incidence of unemployment and other forms of deprivation obliges the state to provide compensating benefits to those who do not share the relative affluence of the rest. Right, so remember, as you denationalize the mines and as you take away welfare, there's lots of unemployment. And that one or two things happen. Either that either people work hard to find new opportunities, right? Or the government steps in and offers the welfare or the nets to be able to keep people, to be able to make sure that people are not suffering, which ultimately will keep them in that space to a large degree. And there's what to be said about both sides. There's lots of people who suffer, unfortunately. He says, but it's the government's responsibility to offer those to those in deprivation. But it is not easy for state benefits to be given to individuals without affronting their human dignity. It is successfully accomplished in the case of non-means tested entitlements such as child benefits and old age pensions, but when more detailed inquiries into their circumstances to be made, it demands the services of well-trained, patient and sympathetic civil servants. The administrative economies introduced by the DHSS is in the face of the ever-growing numbers of claimants produce situations of acute personal humiliation. The large number of benefits not taken up by those entitled to them and the degrading conditions under which benefits have to be claimed in many DHSS offices testify to the failure of our society to find an acceptable solution to one of the more inhumane consequences of our free market economy. So he's saying it's very hard, it's degrading to have to go make a claim for benefits. And because of that, therefore people don't claim, and therefore people are falling through the cracks, and people are suffering, which is, by the way, true. This is a terrible truth in society. The government's not doing enough to provide, and to provide effectively for those in need. So Rav Jacob says, yes, it is true. There is the importance of we'll call it the dignity of the recipient and the responsibility of the giver. There's no question. He says, however, Torah doesn't look at things that way. Torah does not look at things that way. So his observation is, and this is a very fascinating theological observation, he says in source 23, you can't close your hand if there's somebody who's in need. You can't close your hand. Why? Why is that? Is that as a function of the entitlement of the receiver, or as a responsibility of the giver? That's the question that's at hand. If you're to ask the Archbishop of Canterbury, the answer is the entitlement of the receiver. You cannot have a society which has people who are impoverished, and therefore they are entitled to the benefits, and therefore the government needs to jump to ensure that they're receiving, because that's their entitled benefit. But Rav Jacob says that's not the way the Torah looks at it. The Torah looks at it as the relationship not on the side of the receiver, but on the side of the giver. Everybody has the responsibility to give. It is your responsibility to give. And therefore I have the responsibility to earn, to succeed, to feel good about my earnings, and to give. In fact, this is so true that it spans the board. As we looked at a little bit last week, even the poor have the responsibility to give. And therefore the dignity of the giving or the receiving is in that everybody is in the same bucket. Everybody has the responsibility to help those. It's seen as us being the messenger to a certain degree. In fact, here's an example of this in halacha. When you come to the Shemitah, there's this thing called the pruzbul, right? So this is like Hillel was Masak in this pruzbul, and it seems so counterintuitive, because here you go. What happens is the Torah says you got to lend, right? Comes the seventh year, and then at the end of the seventh year, all the debts are cancelled, right? So what's going to end up happening, just a basic social economic outcome of this is you're not going to find any loans in the sixth year, right? Because let's be honest, right? The reason people are loaning then, so that means to say that the economy will grind to a standstill, right? People won't be opening up businesses, people won't be doing anything in that sixth year. So so Hillel comes along and says, no, what we'll do is we will pass the authority of the collection of the debts based into a communal institution, to an enterprise rather than an individual, and therefore the debts will be sustained, and therefore people carry on lending money. That's generally how it's seen, and therefore, in a certain sense, everybody says, well, that's kind of like Reform Judaism, right? Right. So we don't like what the Torah is saying, so we'll find a loophole to make it easier for us to carry on doing what we're doing, in spite of this, this divine regulation. So how does that work precisely? Says the Rashbam, in understanding this, is we perhaps misunderstood the whole process. Listen to the concern that Hillel had. Take a look at source 24 in the Rashbam. This is Rabbeinu Shmuel, the grandson of Rashi, in his commentary on the Gemara in Bava Basra, where the pruzbul is discussed. He says, Lefisha Ra Hillel, Shenimnoin Ha'ashirin Milahalvois La'aniyim. There were no loans being given out in the 6th year, mipnei yiras hashvius shemetashtes meshametes that it would cancel the debts. Vayu ovrin al mashakasu penia davar im lovavcha bli ayal. He saw that the people were transgressing their personal responsibility to give to others. Therefore, Amad Hillel his skin pruzbul prois revach kamoshi friz al midosov. So therefore he said that in order to allow people to do what is their responsibility, he created the pruzbul, which means, just to appreciate what he's saying, is his concern was not for the impoverished. His concern was for the giver who was doing evil. The Torah says, don't be evil in your heart and withhold debts. And they were all doing that because they were scared of losing their loans. They were scared of the Shemitah. So in order to facilitate people doing what they needed to do, which is giving debt. Now you say, but wasn't he concerned about the social implications? No. The social implications are an outcome of the responsibility of the individual. That's his argument. Now, by the way, how did he do it? It happens to be a very fascinating thing, is that essentially by ceding your rights. If you read the actual, the pasuk, go call Baal Mashe Yodai. That's all the very powerful words. The creditor, the Baal, the owner of the money, needs to shamoit, needs to relinquish. What he was doing was he was creating a similar mechanism where you're actually signing over, you're relinquishing your rights to another entity as part of this as well. So just to appreciate what's happening over here. It's not because the bottom of society needs it, it's rather because everybody in society is responsible to do it. Nachman, yes?
But in Judaism, Kol HaPoshet Yad is only applicable once a year. We have no obligation for Kol HaPoshet Yad.
No, we do to a certain degree. So if you remember, last week the Rambam says, if you have a knock on the door and there's no way of figuring out who this person is, there's no background, and they need to eat, you have to give them food to eat. You have to give them something to get food. More than that, not. But there is a basic, we'll call it, living requirement. If somebody needs food, you need to give to them. But even independent of that, the point is like this: is that when, let's say it's verified, let's say that to the case the Torah talks about is verified, we know this is a person who's impoverished, right? We know this is a person who's in a difficult situation, and they extend their hand. Am I giving because they are entitled to receive because of the fact that they're in a lower economic strata in society, or am I giving because I have the responsibility that's upon my shoulders of giving? And the answer is the latter, not the prior, not the former.
You're 10% already. You still have the obligation to give them, even if you gave your homage.
Correct.
You still have to give them if they come to your house.
Correct. That's what it seems like, and it's certainly verified. If not verified, at least minimally. That's what it seems like. But again, it's not because we need to create the systems to support everybody, but rather that everybody has to be giving. And his observation is that that's the way to avoid humiliation. By creating government systems, there's an automatic humiliation. I know somebody's on welfare. And he told me he cannot get out of welfare right now. There's no way he can work. There's no way he can work because he can't find a job which is going to pay for his medical benefits, right? And will give him enough of a part-time allowance into the work world again, that's going to be enable him to have the dignity of getting out of it. It's very hard, and it was all well intended, right? And thank God for it, because there'll be thousands of people who would be suffering otherwise. But there's a humiliation that comes from it as well. And what Rabbi Jacobowitz is observing is you break the cycle of humiliation when everybody's on the same playing field in terms of giving, in terms of the responsibility as opposed to the entitlement. There's other sources, just to quote one last one we'll look at together. We looked at the Rambam in terms of the fact that teach a person how to fish, right? About the giving them a job, not the money. But more than that, in source 26, he says, Tani b'shem Rabbi Yeshua, Yosem Mashe balabais oisem ha'ani oisem balabais. We should know that we sometimes think that we're so magnanimous, we're so good and wonderful, we're giving. But really, truly, actually, the person who we are giving to does more for us. Shekain amra rus naami l'naami shema ish asher asisi imoy hayom. The person I did with today is, and she calls Boaz. V'lo amra asher asa imi, not that he did with me, ela asher asisi imoy, that I did with him. Meaning to say, what is it? She gave more to Boaz, and Boaz gave to her. Harbei pu'ulos v'harbei tovos asisi imoy b'shil shechilani prusa achas. The Torah society looks at us as the individuals and says to us, you have the responsibility to give, and guess what? You'll be gaining more out of it. That's how you break the cycle of humiliation. Ultimately, he points out that where do we see the system? We see the system that even the poor are required to give. They have their own sense of dignity because they give. Where do we see this? Is the Levium. How does this work? The Levium are essentially supported by society. We need to have teachers, so it's systemized. It's part of the culture that 10% of our agricultural wealth goes to the Levium. They then serve in the base of English. They serve as teachers. They serve as scribes. They serve as the spiritual educators for our children in the next generation. But guess what? When they receive their meiser, they have to give what's called a meiser min meiser. They themselves have to give to the Kohanim as well, meaning they give back, which means to say that even those who are on support are giving support. And so Rabbi Jacobus is pointing out, and that's how dignity is created, is by responsibility, not by entitlement, ultimately. And he points out at the top of page 11, guided more by moral concerns rather than economic theories and suppositions, a Jewish religious contribution would lay greater emphasis on building up self-respect by encouraging ambition and enterprise through a more demanding and more satisfying work ethic, which is designed to eliminate idleness and to nurture pride in eating the toil of one's hands as the first immediate targets. As he points out, any job is better than paid idleness. Now, folks, this is a very deeply complex topic, and there are political and social and economic theories and millions of words that are written about this, and those who are involved in this in different states and different state laws and different inner cities and sees the effects of this. It's a very painful subject. Everything is done from an intent, at least in theory, of trying to help. But how do you try to help? And what Jacobus is essentially saying is, don't look at the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, as an expression of Marxist theory. That's his point. Marxism looked at essentially shaking everybody up, distributing wealth. Nobody's allowed to get rich. Rich is bad. Jobs and everybody needs to get equal. A system which we've seen has failed in multiple societies. The Torah does not advocate for that. The Torah advocates for the rights of the individual, the responsibility of the individual, which eliminates eliminates the humiliation, and also at the same time ensures that societies do succeed. Couple this now with what we just learned at the beginning with the Rambam. Let's go back to the Rambam for a second. What the Rambam says, every city needs to ensure that it has the ability to cater for those who are less fortunate. And how is it seen? It's seen as the responsibility of residents of every single person in this as well. And the Rambam concludes, and I'd like to go back to page 2, the very top of the page. And this, I think we'll close with this, because Jewish society is complex and it's nuanced. But take a look at the top box, second paragraph. He says, Me'olam, forever, lo ra'inu v'lo shamanu. We have never seen nor heard. But kahal mi Yisrael, in a Jewish community, she'ein lohem kupa shel tzedakah, that does not have a charity organization supporting those less fortunate. Aval tamchu yesh mekom shenagu v'boy v'yesh mekom shelo nagu, the soup kitchen, you see difference. V'minag pashut hayom sheyu gabay kupa machzirin b'chol yom u'machlikin me'erev Shabbos le'erev Shabbos. Every Jewish society cares for its poor, not by saying you don't deserve the wealth, but by saying that it's the responsibility of the community to distribute as needed for those who are in less fortunate circumstances. Ultimately, it was concluded, and ultimately, Margaret Thatcher had a very warm relationship from before this and after this as well. And she, in source 30, she reportedly told people that she wished Rabbi Jacobowitz were the Archbishop of Canterbury. She ultimately knighted the Lord Jacobowitz, and there was a very close relationship between them, not just politically, but also personally as well. And I would just leave for further reading on today, because it's more complex with the recent economic downturns and the falls of the market and the buyouts of banks starting in 2008. It's worthwhile reading Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs's most recent book called Morality, and he has a chapter talking about, we'll call the top 1%ers, which are a little bit of a different angle on greed, and it's very, very fascinating to attenuate what we just learned over here with that perspective. But that's I think a little bit beyond the scope of our discussion today. Rabbi, thank you so much for taking the time. I hope everybody has a wonderful, meaningful day.